Okay, so the debate this evening, to round things off, I hope we can entertain you with some lively discussion. I think that's pretty much a given. The topic this afternoon is energy scarcity, threat or fiction. So it's a really interesting debate, and I think one that's changed quite a lot in recent years. So supply outlooks, for North America have been transformed recently to the point where we're seeing the continent reframe its position within the context of global energy flows. At the same time, we've seen the ongoing downturn in the global economy make a structural impact on energy demand, and certainly for a lot of parts of the OECD, this seems to be a permanent change. Now, does this perhaps put the topic of energy scarcity on the back burner? On the other hand, we've got an Asia which is growing. There's maybe some questions about how quickly China may grow. But if we are expecting to see China reach even half the standard of living that we enjoy in the West, then we could be seeing a China which consumes twice as much energy in 2030 than it does today. And to put that in context, that's about the same as the US. So some pretty significant challenges there. Now, on the supply side, we may see issues around the availability of some fuels. We may see issues around the desirability of some fuels. So there are issues around pollution, there are issues around the efficacy of renewables, there are issues around the desirability of nuclear power. All of these kind of, if they were to act at the same time, would raise this energy scarcity issue once more. So it's a very crucial debate. It's very crucial that we're having it at this time. So with me, I'd like to introduce Professor Alex Kemp. He's already spoken today. He's a professor of petroleum economics at the University of Aberdeen. To his right, I've got Roberto Aguilera, who's a research fellow at Curtin University in Australia. I've then got Michael Kumhof from the IMF, who's in the modelling department there. And finally, Kjell Aleklett from the University of Uppsala in Sweden. So each participant on the panel is going to give a 5-minute talk, a 5-minute speech. We'll then go to about a 25-minute discussion within the group and then open it up to questions for the last 20 or 25 minutes. So to kick things off, I'll go from right to left. So Professor Kemp.
Okay, I guess my starting point would be that there isn't really a shortage of energy in the world in the sense of resource availability. The supply shocks which we've experienced in the last 30, 40 years have been due not to problems relating to the actual reserves, physical reserves and physical resources, but to other ones. So in my lifetime, I remember well the 73, 74 oil price shock, 400% increase in the oil price in a very short time. There were plenty of reserves in the world, but they were being withheld. OPEC began to show its strength and withheld some reserves, and the price shot up. This led to a panic increase in precautionary and speculative demand, which caused the price to go up further. So the short-term elasticity of response of non-OPEC supplies is really quite low, and particularly because the incremental reserves come from offshore, and to develop these takes quite some time. Then at the end of the 70s, just when the world was getting a little bit used to the higher prices, there was another doubling of prices. And again, there was nothing to do with reserves on the ground. It was to do with the Iranian Revolution, when the Iranian workers went on strike. And again, that made a big impact on the supplies on the market, and the price doubled. Speculative precautionary buying enhanced the problem. And then, of course, we did have the supply response from non-OPEC, and in the 80s, the price collapsed to $10 in 1986. And so we proceed. You could have a downward shock as well as an upward shock. So we had certainly a big downward shock then, and a big downward shock again in 1998 when OPEC was in disarray and increased their quotas on production at a time when the financial crisis in the Far East caused demand in the Far East to go down considerably, so the oil price collapsed again. So we come to this century, and now this century the price has increased from $20 the beginning of the century, went up to 140, then down to 40, and now it's currently about 100. The conventional view is that this is due to demand growth. Well, and everybody says China, India, demand growth. Yes. But in other parts of the world, the demand has actually been falling. And demand growth this century for oil, it increased from 1% per year to 2% per year. So compared to what happened from 1945 to 1970, it's nothing, because it increased then by 7.5% per year. I think the fundamental cause of the price increase this century has been the sluggish supply response. So again, we're looking at what's causing that. It's not, again, reserves in the ground, and it's above the ground factors. So it's OPEC countries in particular not allowing nasty oil companies to come in and produce their oil, but they themselves are hampered one way or the other. Like the government takes all the revenues from them, so they can't invest, like in Venezuela or Iran, in other countries. Well, maybe they are not with the depletion policy. Maybe they don't want to increase their production, even if they've got ample reserves, because they want to keep the price up. It's the cartel. So in all this period, we've had technological advances. So in my lifetime, we've gone from shallow waters in the southern basin, developing technologies to do northern, central North Sea. Now we're doing Atlantic Ocean. We've got the technological capability to go to the Arctic if necessary, and companies are going there. So technological advances certainly can go a long way. But as for the fundamental issue, there isn't really any significant evidence of a lack of physical resources. And I will end by saying that technological advances can make more resources economic, but I wouldn't go as far as to go along with what is implicit in the program there. I'm hoping that we wouldn't need to produce all the oil in the world, because I think Sheikh Yamani was correct many years ago when he said the Stone Age didn't end because of lack of stones. The Oil Age won't end because of lack of oil. I would hope that we would increase our recovery factor in the North Sea from 40% to who knows, but certainly not to produce it oil. I would certainly hope that by that time we'll have a lot of renewable energies available to take over.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. I echo a lot of what Professor Kemp has said. A lot of my points, however, deal with unconventional oil and gas, and there are 5 areas in particular I want to cover. The first one dealing with the quantities that are estimated to exist around the world. The second, what does it take to access those quantities? Though that'll be brief, we've heard a bit about that earlier today. Third, I'll touch on the economics of unconventional production. Fourth, I want to speculate about whether the development seen in North America can extend globally. And fifth, finally, some brief global market implications. So, in terms of the endowments of unconventional oil and gas, many of you will be familiar with some of the studies, the resource assessments that estimate technically recoverable volumes. There's one that just came out this month by the US EIA. There's also one by the Geological Survey in Germany, BGR. And these studies, they say that the quantities are vast and they're widely distributed. It's important to note, however, that they do not assess the entire world. Notably, they leave out the Middle East and North Africa region, and there are many knowledgeable experts who say that that region in particular probably has greater quantities than what exists in the nations already assessed. But it's one thing, of course, to have abundant resources. Accessing it is something else and depends on a host of factors. Probably the most delaying factor is the buildup of necessary infrastructure. Then there's the ownership issues, the access to drilling rigs, environmental concerns, the water requirements, and many countries and states and provinces, we have seen that if the so-called social license to operate does not exist, then nothing happens. All right, about the economics of unconventional oil and gas, it depends, apart from the above-ground factors on the geological and engineering characteristics, the depth, porosity, permeability, pressures, and so on. And if you're familiar with the summarized supply cost curves done in the IEA studies, you'll see that they estimate that unconventional shale gas, for example, can be produced economically at a price between $3 to $7 per gigajoule. And if you just look at the US, about 25% of the gas in the US is economic at a price below $3 per gigajoule. For the shale oil, another example, there's a study by Rystad Energy estimating that the shale oil is economic at prices between $45 per barrel. That's for some of the higher quality shales, Bakken, Eagle Ford, all the way up to $70 per barrel. And so these costs, it's important to note, are less in some cases than the costs of producing their conventional counterparts. They're also quite a bit less than current market prices. And I wish to say that the extraction methods do continue to improve. Can discuss that more later, but the technology continues to improve. We've heard earlier about multilaterals and increasing the number of stages per well, and there's some research being undertaken as well on making fracking a waterless process, which would bring many benefits, including increased recovery, up to 2 times as much by using a different fluid other than water. Natural gas liquids, for example, propane, butane, would increase the recovery and alleviate many of the environmental concerns. So the big question is whether the revolution is likely to spread. Well, the organizations who do the projections to 2035 and beyond say that a likely answer would be yes, but to varying degrees, and there's lots of uncertainty, and it is very hard to predict where and when. On the where question, the likely leaders are probably those nations that have an existing conventional oil and gas industry, because they would have the infrastructure and it can be adjusted for unconventional. Some of the countries cited are Ukraine, Poland, Australia, China, Argentina. And the cautious energy specialists say that the full effects of shale oil and gas development would not be felt until at least 2030, and actually shale oil would lag behind gas, as has been the case in North America. About the global market implications, if this were to happen on the oil side, You could see a stabilizing effect on oil price, initially putting downward pressure on global oil prices. For gas, you have different gas prices in different regions due to the different market structures across regions, but increased gas reserves and improved transportation technologies could bring the regions into contact with one another, more competition, and you might start to see gas-on-gas pricing and a convergence of prices, if you will. Those are the comments I have for now. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Okay, so arguing the other point, the other two speakers, starting with Dr. Kumhof.
Thank you. So what I want to do is I want to mention two pieces of work that we've been doing over the last 2-3 years and weave in comments that are relevant and that also belong to some of the things that have already been mentioned, that respond to some of those things. We have done empirical work, a paper called The Future of Oil, Geology versus Technology, where we're about to issue an update very shortly with more recent data and more recent estimations. That's a 5-equation model of the world economy where we do statistical forecasting exercises, but of a very different kind from what has been done in the academic literature, which tends to focus on the fairly short run, and we're focusing on the medium to long run forecast for oil prices integrated with oil quantities produced and world GDP. And then another paper, Oil and the World Economy, Some Possible Futures. That's not 5 equations, that's almost 5,000 equations. It's our model of the world, of the entire world economy. And there we're not doing statistical forecasting, but some simulated scenarios that look at the consequences of oil resource issues. So the empirical work, The Future of Oil, combines a conventional economic model with a demand curve for oil that depends on the price, a supply curve for oil that depends on the price, and a world GDP equation where world GDP is to some extent affected by the oil price. The difference to conventional models there is that we put a Hubbard linearization specification into the oil supply curve. Basically, the idea is that we want to not start out with a model that precludes looking at one side of this debate that we're having here. Right? We're having a debate about, is it geology or is it technology? Do we need to make it all or nothing? We don't want to do that. We want to basically say, let's have the data tell us what's important here. And basically then we estimate this with data from 1985 until 2012. The result is this is a model that forecasts over these medium to long horizons way better than the competition. Because it captures an upward trend in the oil price and a slowdown in the rate of growth of world oil production that other models typically have difficulties replicating. What we're forecasting, this is a forecast, I will mention the uncertainty about that forecast in a minute, but the point forecast is that a modest oil growth of around 0.75% per annum, roughly speaking, is possible for the next 10 years. But only if the real oil price almost doubles over the next 10 years. And this is not something that we sort of made up or we put that into the model ex ante. We try to let the data tell us what is going to happen. And this forecast is, by the way, perfectly consistent with the whole shale oil story that we've been hearing here. Because all it says is the supply equation does say that if the oil price increases, then there will be more supply forthcoming. And shale oil is just a manifestation of that. So it's not something that says, oh, your model is wrong because you didn't take into account shale oil. Nonsense. We are taking all that kind of thing into account because when the oil price rises, you will turn to something that's more expensive, dirtier, harder to get to, etc. Exactly what shale oil is. And if you want to say that shale oil goes beyond this, then what you have to argue is that the marginal cost curve for world oil output, which, by the way, is fairly flat and low for all the Middle Eastern oil, and then it starts to become fairly steeply upward bending at the other end, right? And you have to argue that what shale oil does is at some point this marginal cost curve becomes really flat again, maybe at an oil price of, say, $70, $80, or $90, but for a very long and for a very large resource base, so that for the future we don't need to worry. That would be a really strange marginal cost curve. Okay, that's all I want to say about that. We do find very significant uncertainty bands there, so there's a lot we don't know. There's great uncertainty about future shocks to demand. There's great uncertainty about demand and supply elasticities. The problem with a lot of the stuff that is done in this literature is that people splash their point forecast out there and say, oh, this is what we think is going to happen. And if I ask them, well, how likely do you think this is? And how likely do you think that it's going to be very much higher or very much lower? There is no answer, because it is not part of the model to assess that question. It is part of our model to assess that question. So the advantages of this approach is, first of all, transparency. We put all our equations out there. We put all our statistical priors out there. And if you don't agree with us, then you can tell us what we should improve, and we can run scenarios or rerun our estimations to see what that would give us. The problem that I see with part of this literature is that people have black box models. They never tell you what's inside, and they say, trust us, we know what we're doing. We're not saying that. We're saying, here are our equations, criticize us. Okay? Endogeneity is another advantage. We do not feed exogenous paths for the oil price or for world GDP into our model and then say what's going to be the output. We are estimating a model that determines all of these three variables together. And finally, the uncertainty, we're assessing it explicitly. Finally, the simulations, and this gets back to some of the points that have been made here. This is the paper, Oil and the World Economy. So what this statistical model doesn't do very well, because the historical data do not tell us all that much about that, is what would happen to world GDP if there was a very persistent, not just a few months or a few quarters, but a very persistent and essentially permanent shortage in oil. And I'm not saying shortage in the sense, oh, we don't have any oil anymore. Of course, that's a caricature of this view. The view is, what if we have 1 percentage point less growth in world oil output per year, or 2, or 3, which doesn't sound all that much. But when the elasticities on the demand side, the substitution elasticities on the demand side, and the elasticities on the supply side with respect to price are as low as they are, and that's what our empirical work tells us, then this 1 percentage point difference in world oil supply growth makes a huge difference to the oil price. Okay? And that's all we're talking about here. It's a caricature of this slightly pessimistic view to say, oh, we don't have enough resources. We do not have enough. What if we do not have enough growth? Even 1 or 2 percentage points. That's what it's about. Okay? And so we then want to look at, if we were in such a world, what would happen to world GDP? What are the linkages between oil and GDP that the history tells us almost nothing about, because we have never been in a world such as this, if we get there, right? I'm not saying we get there, I'm saying, what if? Let's think about that. And what would be the effect on the economy? And I'm talking here about supply side effect. A lot of people are saying, okay, what is this going to do to the demand? Is it going to harm the airline industry, the car industry? No, I'm thinking about the supply side of the economy. With an essential input into our economy, we're suddenly not to be as abundant as it has been historically, slightly less abundant. What would happen to the supply side of the economy? And the results, basically what's nice is that the baseline results are consistent with the empirical paper that I just mentioned. But then there are important alternatives. One of them would be, what if oil output were actually to decline not just by 1 percentage point as in our baseline, but by 3 or 4 percentage points? There are some scenarios out there which say that. And you get a huge difference in the oil price evolution over the next 10 to 20 years, because the elasticities are so low, because substitution is so hard, and because higher oil prices do not bring forth so much more oil supply, at least in the historical data. Okay? The other alternative is, what if the substitutability, people are always talking, economists are always talking about substitutability can only go up as time goes by. I think that's a fallacy, because oil is a very essential input into our economy, and there will come a point where certain processes cannot run without a sufficient availability of oil. This is, some people have called this entropy, some people are just talking about technological process limits. That what if there's a minimum of oil that you need to produce before you can even start about thinking about growing? And what if substitutability declines to 0 when you get close to that? And you get much larger effects. And the last one, this is my very last point, I think I'm probably over time, but this is a really important point, is what if oil were to be really essential for many, many technologies that we have in our economy? As economists, we always say, how do we explain growth? Oh, it's the different inputs into production, capital, labor, oil, land, whatever, right? Plus total factor productivity, which is the intelligence and genius by which we put all these things together and squeeze much more output out of them. Now, if you think about what a lot of these technologies are, they are good because they have energy, abundant energy to make them possible. And some of them specifically liquid fuels, a lot of the transportation technologies that we have that allow these sophisticated distribution networks that we have. What if you take oil away? And I'm not talking about taking it away altogether. I'm talking about reducing the rate of growth of oil by a few percentage points a year. That's all. And if oil is therefore essential for technology, or at least for some of our technologies, then you get what economists will refer to as a negative technology shock. And that has very, very significant output implications. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily going to happen. This paper is about thought experiment. It's about saying what could be the linkages between oil and output in the world economy if we were to enter a world of persistently greater scarcity than what we have observed in the past. And I think this channel is something to really take seriously in that regard. Thank you.
Okay, so finally, Professor Aleklett.
Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I'd like to go back 10 years, because 10 years ago we started to discuss peak oil, and we wrote a scientific paper, and we said, what will the oil production be at this time? And Colin Campbell and I said that it will be roughly around 85 million barrels per day. And we were called crazy guys. Because at that time, the forecast was that the oil production should be 122 million barrels per day, and the price of oil just now should just be $25 per barrel. You know. And of course, International Energy Agency, US Energy Information, and the World Bank was behind this number. So, of course, these great organizations could not be wrong, was the general statement at that time. But if you look now, we said it should be around 85 million barrels per day, the way BP defined it, and this is exactly what it is now. So we were the only one in the world that was right 10 years ago. If you now look into the future, we see that all these agencies that said it was enormous production in the future, they're going down all the time, and we saw that Sarah is coming down also. But with new technology, according to economical models, it should be much easier to produce big volumes. So why, with all these new technologies available, are they not producing more oil now than they did 10 years ago with this technology not available? That is not discussed and not explained. I'd like to also say that, yes, there had not been a shortage of oil since the Second World War and until, say, 1990, 1920. And the reason is that the oil companies are hidden it away. The real discovery rate in the 60s was 56 billion barrels per year. I mean, everyone is agree about that number. And the consumption at that time was 10 billion barrels. And of course, you cannot show that we are discovering so much oil when we're not consuming so much oil. So they invented the 1P, the 2P, and all this kind of what's allowed to be reported as reserves. So that's very important also to distinguish between reserves and resources, because many people have referred to the future in resources and not really reserves, and that's another chapter that should be discussed maybe more recently. I'd like to say that we are now in a situation that the laws of economy don't function any longer, because the availability of cheap oil is not there any longer. It's a completely different story. The thing that is guiding us into the future is the flow equation. The amount of oil that is possible to take out from the ground in different oil fields. And that is Dreyse's law. And if you look into what the oil industry is doing, is that they are trying to work with different parameters in this. I have written about all of this in my book, Peaking at Peak Oil, and you can, if you like, read more about this in this book. If you now look into the future, one very important thing to discuss is the oil available for import, because many countries need to import oil. And if we now look at the oil production, it stays quite flat, you know, and we see that the oil producing countries are consuming more oil. Take, for instance, Saudi Arabia. They are increasing their own consumption dramatically, and the other states in the Middle East doing the same thing. And we also have India and China that is increasing their share of the oil consumption. So if we look at when in time did we have a peak in the availability of importing oil, and that is absolutely clear, that was in 2005. Since 2005, the oil available to import has declined. And it declined with something like 15% in a couple of years now. If you go into the future, to 2020, I mean, that is not that far away, we see that the OECD countries will, in principle, only has half of the oil available for import at that time compared to what they had in 2005. So that's another fact in the economy, as we heard here. I mean, it's not just the production, it's what is available to buy for the industrial countries that will be very effective and very important for the future. And I must say that we must divide the world into importing and exporting countries, because their life will be completely different. I used to say, take Russia, one of the biggest oil producers in the world. Who in the future will ever export oil to Russia? No one. So what kind of political decisions will they make for their country and their future? The same we see in the Middle East. And I can just mention that a couple of months ago in the Middle East was organized the first ever peak oil conference in Qatar. And I must say that was very interesting, and they realized the reality much, much more than many people outside the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to start with the questions, Professor Kemp, 0.75% annual. Sorry. So excuse me. Sorry. 0.75% oil demand growth is possible for the next 10 years, but only if oil prices double.
Well, my theme has been that there's plenty of oil and gas resources in the world. It's just that the supply response is very sluggish, and in some cases it's deliberate policy. OPEC countries don't want to produce more to keep the price up. So that's really, to me, the basic issues. The potential to increase production is there, quite significant terms. So, I mean, at the moment, the price, what is it, about $100 Brent? So, come down from early in the year, 124, okay? So, it's come down, and yet that is despite sanctions against Iran, enormous potential exporter. Venezuelan production going down because of, they're not managing it, they don't have the investment. Nigeria, because, all the disruptions there. There's plenty of scope for increasing production. It's just that for one reason or another, some deliberate policy, like among OPEC countries, others because of sanctions against Iran, others misguided policies in Venezuela, and all the supply disruptions in Nigeria, and it's difficult to get the extra supply. So we certainly could get more, I think. It's just that above ground factors are stopping it.
Thank you.
Well, actually, for an economic actor being, let's say, a Middle Eastern government, who, as we just heard from Kjell, convened the first peak oil conference a few months ago, it would be entirely rational to withhold current oil production and defer it to the future if they think that a scenario like this is going to happen, or even that it has a significant probability of occurring, because they would maximize revenue by producing their oil further into the future than they are now. So it's not that these are obstinate or irrational governments, if those are their expectations. And again, the broader point I want to make, you're saying the reserve availability is not an issue, there's plenty of reserves around. I don't think we're arguing with that. It's first of all, it's about the flow availability and not about the stock that's there. And the incentives to produce that flow, including the intertemporal incentive that I just mentioned by those governments. And then it's about the price at which those flows are available. And the price at which those flows are available depends on the price elasticity of demand and supply, which are both extremely low. So at some point you might hit a region where, yes, you can always say, yeah, well, we can produce more, but maybe at $200, $250, not now, but many years into the future. Is that really economically still realistic? So that's the question that I would like to ask.
If we look into the shale oil or tight oil in US, we saw the number that their Energy Information Administration says it's possible to recover, and the number was 43 billion barrels. You should remember that the yearly consumption in the world is 31 billion barrels. So what they're saying is that it might be possible for US to bring up 1.5 years global consumption in shale oil. And the other thing is that to keep a constant production just now, when shale oil and shale gas in US, you need to drill 7,000 wells per year. It's possible to do it, no problem to do it. But the thing is that if you're going to increase it, you need to drill 14,000 wells per year, and keep that for 20 years or whatever. We're talking about an industry that will make money, and that is the service industry. But who will really start to invest in the future when the sweet spots are drilled already? I mean, take bacon, for instance. They are now coming into the regions where it's not sure that they will get back the money they invested in the oil field. So again, yes, resources are available, but real reserves that can be put in production, that's a completely different story.
Yeah, if I could say, first of all, if one is going off of the US EIA study, I believe they mentioned 60 billion for the US. I don't know if it changes your point or not, but closer to 2 years than given.
No, for 43 was the...
The figure I showed you was split into three. It was the shale oil and tight oil deposits, the shale oil from shale gas deposits, and the tight oil from shale gas deposits, and the tight oil from shale gas deposits. Add the five together, you get 58 billion in fact.
Okay.
But I mean, that's 2 years compared to 1.5 years.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Something I would agree with two speakers here is about the flows. I mean, I don't believe there's any shortage from a geological point of view based on the studies and how vast apparently the conventional and especially the unconventional quantities are. The question though is, there's several $1 trillion of investment, upstream investment required till 2035 in order to meet the demand requirements. And the question is, will that happen? Will it take place in a timely fashion? And there may be times where it's not happening on time and there are shortages, there's scarcity, but it's a short-run phenomenon, it's self-correcting. So when there's scarcity, prices go up. And this is what led to the shale gas revolution in the year 2000. High gas prices in North America prompted some sort of maverick-style companies to do trial and error with their technology and eventually increase production quite significantly. And several years later, same thing when the price of oil went up dramatically. Again, the companies invested in the technology, and look what's happened since then. So, but agreed, I don't think there's a resource problem, but just the ability, the flows, making it available when needed.
So is there an issue around this flow? Is it a technological challenge that can be overcome, or would you agree that it's a physical limitation to the fields themselves? I'll let Roberto ask you, and then I'll...
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I mean...
Yeah, I think, well, recent history would suggest yes, and as I mentioned, the technology has not played out. It's still improving. The multilaterals from a single well, for example, different directions, different depths, being able to fracture an increasing number of stages. It's hit up to 60 stages today, which is quite a bit, and in the future is predicted to go even higher, perhaps 100 stages per well. Then there's, as I mentioned, the possibility of the waterless frac using some of the CO2 mixes. There was a presentation about it earlier, or liquid nitrogen is a possibility, or the natural gas liquids, which is already used in some formations in Canada. The recoveries are very low so far. We heard 3 to 6%, and they could nearly double if you use natural gas liquids. The NGLs flow back up the well and can be sold off too, and it's attractive also to those countries that have water limitations. China is an example, Australia as well. So it looks like that technology is continuing to improve and will make the unconventional more scalable.
There's one thing that we must remember, and that is that there is different sizes of oil fields. We have the giant oil fields. There is something like 50,000 oil fields in the world, and 1% of them is the giant oil fields. And these giant oil fields produce the majority of the oil so far. But the thing is that these oil fields are old. They are declining dramatically now. And if Schlumberger and Sarah and everyone else in principle agree that the decline in these fields are of the order of 6 to 8% per year. And as this is such huge volume that is declining that fast, it's very hard to replace that with smaller units, you know. And all of these things is very important, because these fields were very cheap to produce oil, and there will be some recovering and so on, but in principle we must remember that the giant fields is declining globally now. Another thing is that if you look at the fields in the Middle East, they are very much giant fields, and they need to put pressure in these fields, and they need it to drill water wells around the fields. If we take, for instance, Gawar field, it's a field that is 26 kilometers wide, and the distance of it is the distance between Paris and Brussels, you know. So just put water pressure in that field, you must drill an enormous amount of wells and an enormous investment to really get things going. So what you see now in Saudi Arabia, for instance, is that they are trying to develop their smaller fields, because that is not so expensive as to doing the very big fields. Yes, there are resources in the future, but the flow rate will stay quite at the same rate that it is now. And when the big giant fields are declining, we will see a decline in the global oil production.
Okay, let's go.
I'd like to connect a little bit to this. You know, I'm a macroeconomist, so I only deal with, you know, things like GDP, interest rates, exchange rates, etc., that kind of thing. And so I can't compete with many of you when it comes to these stories about technology, but I think this session is a little bit about the bigger picture. And there is a danger with people who are very knowledgeable at a particular technological solution, is that they then draw inference from that to some macroeconomic doability of all of this. And I think what is very important to do responsible macroeconomics when it comes to this whole question is that we need to add things up. We need, you know, these individual stories are not enough, because we know that some things are declining very fast, and so we need to make sure that when we add all these little other things up, it amounts to enough. And so we're actually going to call the latest version of our working paper that's going to come out very soon, mind the gap. Okay, because there's a gap potentially, and we need to know how we can fill it. Right? And so, whenever we do forecasts, we need to add everything up. And I would say we should never produce a forecast for the quantity of available oil without the associated price path. I'm repeating myself here, but this is very important when it comes to macroeconomic sustainability.
Question for Professor Kemp. You mentioned during your presentation that all of the price shocks, either on the positive or negative side, have been socio-political or above ground risk related. Now, that may be true of what's happened up until now, but how can we be sure that that's a good guide to what's going to happen in the future?
Well, what I'm saying is that what's inhibiting supplies now are either mismanagement or sanctions. Sanctions against Iran. Do you think Iran doesn't want to produce more oil? Are they keeping it for another day? Don't be. That's ridiculous. And the OPEC countries want to keep the price up because they're a cartel. So that's what we're faced with for the foreseeable future.
Something that is discussed very much when it comes to price and production is the spare capacity. The numbers of spare capacity that is mentioned, you should know, is not really real increasing in oil production and so on. It's availability, for instance, for Saudi Arabia to pump oil from their storage rooms. They have enormous storage room, and they are also building these storage room up. In principle, they are producing oil at the same rate all the time. And then if they sell it, yes. If they don't sell it, they put it in the storage room, So the spare capacity is not really oil from the ground. It's oil available to sell during a certain time period. And of course, if we're talking about the spare capacity of 3 million barrels per day that some people are discussing, that is equal to the total production of the North Sea, including UK and Norway. I can't imagine that any country will just have that kind of facility waiting for maybe be used for a couple of days and so on. This is something that you also must take into consideration when you look into the future. So there are many, many things. And another thing that is very important to understand is that in the Middle East, they need $90 per barrel to get the society function, because that is what they need for their budget. If they go lower, they will have big problems. We can take, for instance, Alberta now. They have big problems because the shale oil, oil sand, the oil sand price is going down now because there is not enough refineries that can take their products. And they have made investments that has a much higher revenue from the oil sand than they get just now. So Alberta has an economical problem because of that. And if we talk about the end of using of oil is the refineries, we should know that what's happening now is that if there is a more production of oil sand in Canada, that will cut off the Venezuela oil production to United States, because there is a limited number of refineries available to take that kind of oil.
Pipeline capacity as well has been a problem lately in Canada, and as a result you do have that glut, and the price of Canadian crude has been as low as $45 per barrel. So
no, it's not enough. It's more that the refineries cannot take it.
But I would agree that the pipeline capacity is an issue, and that crude is stranded, and that helps to drive down some of the costs.
Sadly, Calgary is underwater right now as well. I just came from Calgary, and that's the downtown is grinded to a halt. So it's unheard of in Calgary. But
I'd just like to ask Professor Kumov Dr. Kumov a question about the model that you use, and you mentioned how sensitive it is to increasing demand, and I wonder if it's as sensitive on the downside to slowing demand. What if we see a China that doesn't grow quite as quickly as we think, or we really have reached peak oil demand in the OECD?
Yeah, it would be, that would lead to a significant drop in the oil price in a model like that. Yeah, if you take the demand factor in isolation and say that, you know, supply is chugging along as it has been, then that would lead to a significant drop in the oil price.
Okay. And
relative to whatever trend it had before.
And due to that, could we accommodate production for longer, or would the scarcity issue presumably push back into the future?
Do you have in mind a model where the URR in the world is ultimately fixed, and so it's just a question of how to allocate it over time, or what is the scenario you have in mind?
Well, my scenario was if we reach or approaching peak oil demand rather than seeing demand going up into the future.
Right. Well, if the ultimately recoverable oil is the same, and you have a peak oil demand story, then you would get a more smoothed out profile over time, right? Sure, of course, you would get a lower oil price, and you would push the peak back if there is a peak. Yes.
Okay. I recognise that maybe we've been talking a lot about oil supply. Maybe I've forgotten to put a watch on the table, so I'm not sure how many more minutes we've got for this discussion. But kind of on the demand side, I wonder if any of the panel would like to address, the technological progression that we see on oil consumption.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about peak oil on the supply side, yeah, but peak oil on the demand side. And I instance the UK. When was peak oil in the UK? 1973. We're well below now what would be consumed in 1973. So we have had enormous long-run substitutability. We have moved from oil central heating in our houses. We have moved from power generation from oil, hardly any of that now. We also have lost heavy industries, so our shipbuilding and steel and all that have gone right down. So structural change has reduced the demand for oil quite a lot, such that, my view is that whether it's peak demand or peak supply, there's nothing particularly dramatic for the world about that. And we passed peak demand way back in 73. I can't imagine when we're likely to achieve it. And there we are.
Would you like to jump in? You had a...
Well, I mean, we see that we are changing the use of oil. I mean, so if we take the transportation sector, that is the most important when it comes to the consumption of oil, we see that there still is increasing the amount of oil going into the transportation sector, even if the production of oil is flat. So yes, we will change efficiency, and United States has a big possibility to use cars that use less in energy and things like that. And that is, of course, important for our future. I mean, when I'm saying that we are reaching maximum production, that don't mean I mean that we are reaching the maximum of the future of the world and so on. But we had to rethink how we are going to use it for the future. And when it comes to price, I just wonder if we have the price increase in 2008, it went dramatically up. I can't see that there was any outside factors than just the shortage of oil that gave that high increase in price. I mean, then of course the economical crashes and so on. But I mean, that is something, just shortage of oil when it comes to have that increase in price.
Doctor?
Two comments on the UK experience. We did some research on this for the April 2011 World Economic Outlook at the IMF, and what we stress there is that a lot of the things that happened in the past, such as the big switch in power generation, were one-off things that cannot easily be repeated. I mean, it was very easy to think in the 70s that it would be that one could switch power generation from oil to something else, but and very quickly. That's very important. It's very, very quickly. That's not a big problem. To switch our entire transportation infrastructure over from liquid fuels to something else is also possible, but not nearly at the same speed. Okay? And so we have to be careful with these historical analogies, because I think we need to add our knowledge to that. And this big one-off switch that was possible in the 80s is not possible to the same extent today. The other thing that was helpful to the UK is, of course, that a lot of heavy industries were lost. But that's exactly the point, right? I am worrying about the world and not just about the UK. And the UK has basically, and the US as well, has replaced domestic energy use with energy use that is in the imported products that come into the country, because the energy is now used in another country in order to make what the UK still needs. So what is consumed in the UK, a lot of these imported products, they have the high oil content, even though that oil is not used in the UK. So that still doesn't mean that we haven't had efficiency improvements, and we have efficiency improvements every year. Our estimates show that as well. But it's a very gradual process of relatively small magnitudes, and if we were to have a several percentage point loss in the growth rate of world oil output, these efficiency improvements would not be able to completely make that up.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've run over time a little bit, but we are going to open up the floor now. So anybody, okay, man in the tie behind you. That's it. He was the first to. No, sorry. Just a few more minutes.
I want to react about the behavior of OPEC production, since it was mentioned 2 or 3 times.
It's on.
First, since the revolution, what's happened in Libya, OPEC production has increased the production by more than 2 million barrels per day. Now, currently, OPEC are producing around 31 million barrels per day, which is more than the market is needed. On top of this, we have a huge increase from US and Canada, and the total. Also, Russia is producing, I think, more than 10.4, what is the highest since a record level. What I mean by this, there is no shortage of the oil, there is no lack of the oil in the market. Additionally, if you look at the demand behavior, you have OECD has already picked up in 2005. Emerging market, the pace of growth is going down. What it means, on the top you have huge oil in the market. The other hand, you have a decline in the growth. The price we are having now doesn't to do with the lack of the oil. There is other factor. What there is a study, even the academic study, they are showing that there is other factor, no fundamental behind what we are having now. I think this should be mentioned, and I refer to just the meeting between the IEA, OPEC, through the IEF about the impact of the paper market and the relation between the physical market and paper market. It was done in the IEF, and you refer to this to see what behind the prices at 100 or 120 is not do with OPEC, as it was mentioned by Professor Kemp. Well, in Nigeria, like example, we mentioned that Nigeria have problem. You know that Nigeria, their export to US had declined by more 30%. The main reason because there is no buy-in from US due to the boom in the shale oil. Thank you.
Well, you'll just need to ask the question, what would happen if there was a competitive oil market? I would say there would be a lot more production. From the Middle East, Iran, there would be a lot more production.
How you can measure there is a lot of oil in the market? Look at one variable, what is the stocks, the inventory. The inventory now is the highest, especially in the US, forever. Even they have a problem they have a saturation of storage. They cannot even find a place to store their oil, or the oil coming from other country. I mean, it's obvious that the market, it will supply. We should not reflect that the current prices through to the OPEC. If the problem with Iran, of course, I mean, Iran, they cannot export, but Iran, they are putting this in storage. if really Iran will export the whole oil, we will have OPEC producing more than 33 million barrels per day, and I think this prices could easily collapse tomorrow.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If it was a competitive market, the price would be lower.
Okay, next question. You've already got the microphone.
My question, Chairman, is to the two speakers representing Viewpoint B, which was, we can't afford the energy, labour and capital cost to prolong the fossil fuel era. And my question to them is, what would your response be to the viewpoint, we can't afford the energy and capital cost to provide a new renewable energy future or era?
Well, first of all, this, Viewpoint B is not really my viewpoint in the sense we can't afford the energy, labor, and capital costs. We just have to, right? Right now, there are no scalable alternatives to fossil fuels, so we're going to have to continue using fossil fuels for the foreseeable future, as several speakers have already said. So the way this Viewpoint B was phrased, I didn't really find myself in complete agreement with that. But your question about whether renewables are going to be an adequate substitute, just taken by itself, without relating it to Viewpoint B, is I have my doubts given the relative magnitudes involved. Of course, everything helps, and we should try everything that's available. But you have to also say I'm a macroeconomist, and when it comes to like individual technologies and what should we try and what should we not try and how promising is this, there are people here who are better qualified to answer that question.
Well, we see now that the investment in renewable energy is declining. I mean, in 2013, the investment was less than in 2011. So there will be a hard time to really replace the existing systems with renewable energy. If not, the governments go in and put in money. I mean, most of the renewable energies are produced because of the fact that it's subsidized by different methods in different countries. And the problem, as I see it, is that the high oil price means that some countries that are dependent on oil and importing oil, they must, for some reason, export something else so they can pay for the oil, And I think that what we see now in Italy, in Spain, and so on, we see that the high oil and gas price, the increase of that, they have not managed to sell more things so they can pay for it. And if we look into the future situation in UK, we are seeing from all the forecasts that the decline in production of natural gas and oil will be dramatic, but I think the consumption will maybe stay flat. And that means that UK must find something else to export. I mean, you don't exporting oil and gas any longer, but you must find something to export to be able to pay for that in the future, or the pound will go down to a lower levels.
I would just add, if there was a global shale revolution, then the efforts to develop renewables would become more costly.
Thank you. This man in the front row here, or second front row, thanks.
I've got a quick sort of anecdote. I work in the chemical industry, and we've been working on a gas project. Not going to go anywhere. But when we went out to look at getting this engineered, the lead time was 7 years from project and sort of start to finish. We had to place orders if we were going to go ahead with this project for some of the equipment before we would even know whether we could get a permit to build it, because that was the lead time. If we really expect to be able to engineer ourselves out of the crisis which potentially could evolve, I want to know where all the engineers are going to come from, because they are like gold dust. We've got engineers working for our company, and they're all heading for retirement, and we have a dearth of young talent coming forward to fill their shoes with the experience. And I work for a German company. They don't employ me because of my language skills. They employ me for other reasons. And that's the situation. It really is critical in getting the manpower to be able to engineer some of these solutions. The engineers don't exist.
Well, make a comment just about the oil industry, and we see where the skill will come in the future. It's clear that the only country that really has schools for training young people when it comes to the oil industry is China. And I think that 90% of all the oil workers in the world in some 10, 20 years will be Chinese.
Okay, so a hand just went up on the aisle, back on, yeah, that's it, yeah.
There was an interesting report came out about a month ago from the Carbon Tracker group down in London, and they said that if the market was to take climate change seriously, that we could produce about 500 gigatons of carbon in the next 20 years, but there's about 2,500 gigatons of carbon in the current asset books of oil, coal and gas companies. If the markets were to take our climate change seriously, you would have to have an 80% reduction in valuation of oil and gas coal companies. That kind of revaluation, what would that do to liquidity, to investment, to the potential for investment in alternatives as well?
Anyone want to nominate you?
Well, sure, if I understand the question right, but it seems to me that the projections say that realistically, for several decades, we'll be in for a fossil fuel future. Beyond 2035, it could be still over 70% fossil fuels. But I think the question is what combination of oil, gas, and coal will have the most market share. So given that background, I think natural gas, the cleanest of all, would bring the most environmental benefits in terms of emissions.
I think those are business as usual scenarios. We're not in a business as usual scenario. Things are changing quite rapidly, and I think the notion that the past trend is going to continue is kind of ridiculous. That the technologies are going to have to change, and past trends are not going to, or do not necessarily continue going forward. Yeah, that's my. Sorry, just that we are working in European models. That when you do start looking at the science from the IPCC, you do start looking at the carbon constrained scenarios, looking at energy systems models. There is rapid reduction of oil, coal, and gas out of the energy systems, both in global scale, in regional scale, and national scales, in the non-conventional, non-business as usual scenarios. So there are other alternatives out there, but they just cost a whole lot of money.
I think it's very important that when we look into the future, we must find a way to get a growing economy without using more fossil fuel. And for the time being, we see the correlation between the increase of use of oil and the increase in GDP is been there for a very long time. And even if we don't need so much now, but I mean, if you take China, for instance, the yearly increase in GDP of 7% per year is coupled to a 7% increase of use of oil, for instance. And we will see these kind of things at other developing countries that they need a lot of oil to be able to increase their economy. But we must find a new way, I think, to look into the economy so we can see a growth in the global economy with using less fossil fuel. And if we don't do that, I mean, all the IPCC's future discussion says that we should use less fossil fuel, but we also like to have an economy in the future.
Yep. And what this actually gets back to the point that the gentleman over there in the third row made, is that, if there's if you do take this debate seriously and you think that there is a significant probability it might come to pass, then public policy needs to focus on educating engineers, on really getting a really strong engineering schools going, because if this is true, there are so many technological problems that need to be addressed, and that's what people need to be working on, and not financial engineering. That's really very important.
I think we've got time for probably one or two more. So, this man here in the glasses. I promise I'll go further back next time.
Thank you very much. We just mentioned, getting more young people into energy, which actually sits very well to my question. In terms of total percentage of total factor input as a whole of the economy, do you think the energy sector is going to command a higher share of the total factor of production in the world as we go up? And with that, how does that play into the cost of energy?
I think it's a question for both you guys. So,
You want to start?
Okay. First point about engineers and energy. I didn't read the article, but in this month's SPE, Journal of Petroleum Technology, there's an article saying that actually it peaked a while back, number of graduates, but it's going up again. So it looks like engineering is becoming popular once again. Maybe an article worth reading. And its place in the economy, well, at least if, again, referring to an unconventional oil and gas revolution, if you look at what happened in North America, there's an IHS 2012 study about the macroeconomic benefits, and I had a few figures, but it's created a huge number of jobs, almost 2 million. It's contributing labor income of 240 billion, which is almost 1.5% of GDP, which is impressive. And they don't see this slowing down either. By 2035, the unconventional oil and gas would employ 3.5 million people in the US with fiscal revenue, taxes of 125 billion. And so huge macroeconomic benefits apart from the security benefits.
Yeah, I think this was an excellent question, and I think I have two separate things to say about it. Economists would typically look at the whole oil issue and say, well, the cost share of oil, I think in the US economy is something like 3.5% on average over the last few decades, cost share among overall input costs. And so this can't be a very important factor of production. And so even if we're facing very significant price increases, the economy will somehow be able to cope with that. There are two things wrong with that. One of them you refer to, and the other thing I already referred to in my introductory remarks. One of them is, if you double the price of oil in an economy where the elasticities of substitution, meaning the substitutability between oil and other things, are very, very low. For the sake of argument, let's say it's zero. It's of course not zero, but let's say it's zero. Then if you double the oil price, you double the cost share, almost. I mean, right? And then you go to 7%. And then if you double it again, you go to 14%. Then you're starting to talk, just because of a doubling of the oil price or an increase in the oil price, you're starting to talk about a factor that accounts for a much more significant share of overall input costs. So if oil prices keep increasing, we are going to go into that kind of region. The other thing is, and I'm repeating myself here, but it connects well to your question, is that 3.5% really representative of what oil really contributes to the economy? Our argument in one of the papers that we published as IMF working papers is that perhaps not. It's just a speculation, right? And the future will show. But the speculation is that a lot of the technologies that we have out there, again, as I said, I'm repeating myself, the technologies that we have out there for their viability and their continued use depend on the availability and relative abundance of fossil fuels, and more specifically, in some cases, liquid fuels. Meaning that the actual contribution of oil to output would be more than that 3.5 historic percent. In fact, perhaps much more. We don't really know. We're only going to know, because this is a counterfactual, we're only going to know in the case there is a real shortage of oil. But then it could be much more serious than what the 3.5% would indicate. Okay.
Does it just, the oil engineers, the people working on oil rigs, does it count, the people supporting the scientists researching on, the cobalt methane technologies, because if we count all those people, I'll say I agree with you. What we at right now might not be just 3.5%, and as that percentage go up, I don't see the energy costs going down, because that's just simple economics and mathematics. That's what I think. Sorry.
Okay, last question. The man in the tie with the glasses was the first to put his hand up, so.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel if they think that there may be one simple factor that will decide whether we have energy scarcity or not, and that's whether we can do something to turn around the continually declining rate of energy return over energy invested. Is it not as simple as that we'll hit a point where people will no longer make commercial investments if the energy return over energy invested hits a brick wall?
All right, well, to finish things off, perhaps we'll go through the panel. So, Professor Kemp.
Well, for a lot of oil, the return on investment is perfectly reasonable. What happens, of course, is that throughout the world there are many taxes and royalties and profit-sharing arrangements imposed, but oil as an investment is actually perfectly okay. For renewables, of course, they're to a large extent subsidized. So the investors may get a reasonable return because they're subsidized. So the investments in the UK are being held back because of lack of clarity over the electricity market reform and the contract for difference price, the strike price, to invest in new power stations, that sort of thing, which is an area of government, and they're promising to reveal the key features of that this summer.
Okay. Well, from an economics point of view, the reason that the ratios don't make sense is because they don't attach any monetary values to the energy invested and energy returned. So the way it would actually work in the industry is if an activity is profitable, it goes ahead. So with oil sands, for example, regardless of how much energy you're investing, if you're using cheap natural gas to produce an expensive barrel of oil, that's what happens. So, the ratios make sense from a physical energy point of view, but not economically.
So I looked at Arroy before and sort of drew some charts where this would make a real difference. And as soon as you go below an average Arroy of 10, something like that, roughly that order of magnitude, that alone is like a several percentage point decrease in the world availability of oil. Just all by itself, because it's the world availability of oil outside the oil sector that you really care about, right? And if the world average Arroy were to drop like 6 or 7, would be a really serious number, then you would lose almost as much as you would lose with a several percentage point decrease in the growth rate of world oil production. Now, we're not nearly there yet, but we're also not miles away from it. The broader issue here, in my view, is it's a question of when we produce these forecasts for world oil output, it's a question of how do we count. We should really produce these forecasts for net world oil output, namely net of what the energy sector itself uses in order to reproduce the oil. And then we would be looking at quite different numbers. And then it's not a question of Arroy per se anymore, it's just a question of net oil availability, where Arroy is just one of the factors that influences that.
Yeah, and I agree completely that we should start to look at the net oil situation instead. I mean, you can just take the ethanol production in the United States. How much net energy will that really give us in at the end? Not too much, you know. So if the world should be run on that kind of energy production, I think it will be over already.
Well, thank you very much. My thanks to the panelists. I think it's been a very fascinating discussion, and the fact that we've gone over time and everybody's kept asking questions, I think is testament to that. So thank you very much.